we? We are at the edge of the hill of the city of David. We went down the slope towards the Kidron Valley. That's behind you down below. We walked in a channel that we walked only about half of it. It continues underneath us, and it took all the extra water that no one picked up from the spring and let it flow to the fields outside the city. Please remember, you cannot come to a spring, press a button, and make it stop working. The water flows. So if you don't allow it an outlet, it will find its way out, and water is very powerful. I don't know if you heard the news from the last week of a dam that was destroyed in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And what it's flooding huge spaces. You can't really stop the water. So what you do is you form a way for it to flow, and then you control the water in a better way. And that means there's always water trickling down a few hundred feet down and irrigating the fields outside and so on into the Kidron Valley. So back to Hezekiah and back to his tunnel. An amazing water system that moves the water. Now think, we've been to Chatzor, and what we saw there is going down into the mountain to reach the aquifer, reach the enriched water layer within the rock. This is something totally else. This is moving the spring. And therefore people totally forgot about the Gihon spring and started back to the Shiloach spring. Shiloach becomes in Greek Siloam or Salom. In many European languages it becomes Siloé. And then it becomes, in Arabic, since the 8th century, Silwan, which is the name of the neighborhood still today. As we usually try to say, that names tend to stick and stay. They might change a little bit, but they really stay in the location. So that is Hezekiah's tunnel, moving the water into a new place. So this area of the city isn't important anymore. And during the next many centuries, we're at the edge of town. Just to get the idea, everywhere we're standing and further down and around us, all this was the city dump throughout hundreds of years. And if you really want to know what people ate for lunch and things like that, there are a few interesting finds. I'm just going to throw you to one really interesting find from the Second Temple period, discovered right down here where these stairs go down into an open excavation. They found the city dump from the end of the Second Temple period, 2,000 years ago. And they found out that whoever collected the trash in the city, all the broken glass objects, they threw in one spot. All the broken stone objects, they threw in a different spot. All the broken pottery object, they throw in a third spot. But eventually all these 3-4 spots became one big one. But there's one with only glass, one spot with only stone, and we have no idea why they did such a weird thing 2,000 years ago. So what do archaeologists do when they don't have a good explanation? They say apparently it's something ritual, cultic. So of course the report is called Holy Trash. It published last year, the report of this excavation right here. So there's a trash site, okay, fine. But that's not what we came here for. We came for that. In front of us on bedrock, you can see the natural stone. You can see the city walls of Jerusalem from the Iron Age. Can you see that wall with the quite squarish stones? Notice the stones, they're not big, not like what we saw in the fortress near the spring, not huge.
Iron Age.
Exactly, not huge, no shape type of stone. This is much more roundish and squarish, that they make a lot more sense. This is the Iron Age wall. This is the First Temple period wall, which means we're exactly outside the city. So if the Assyrians are approaching, we're in the wrong spot. As the prophet Isaiah in chapter 22 will say, your valleys will be full of the chariots of the Assyrians. And that's what everyone is terrified, that all these chariots start swarming to all around and closing off the city and attacking. So that will be the valley right here as the other valleys surrounding the city. So before we run away, because the Assyrians are long gone, and we need to get to this tunnel. Here's the passage. Yes, sure.
So those houses up there would be inside the city?
Yeah, those modern homes are inside the city.
Okay.
Definitely. Okay, this tunnel, as you can see, it isn't in a straight line. And this tunnel raises a few questions. Let's make it really cool. It was done by 2 groups. One started very close to the spring. Do you remember the pool with the blue lights?
Yeah.
In that pool, there was some carved doorway.
Yeah.
That doorway is where they started the tunnel. Why there and not from the spring itself? Because if you start at the spring itself, you drown. So they started a few feet away, and only when they finished, they connected it to the spring and let all the water flow in, which means they're actually working in dry surface, which is much easier. So that's one group that started near the spring. The other group started at the pool at the far end, and they were tunneling one towards the other. Just before the end, inside the tunnel, they left an inscription in the wall. There's a legend that says that this inscription was in the middle. No, it wasn't. It was right here, 6 meters before the end. And this inscription was discovered in 1880 by 2 school children. And these 2 school children called their teacher because they found something important. Their teacher copied the inscription. How did he copy the inscription? He brought a newspaper, soaked it in the water, and then attached it to the inscription on the wall, pushed it in, let it dry, and then what happens is he removes it carefully and receives what is known as a squeeze, a copy. The problem is that every crack in the rock looks like a letter, and letters that aren't carved well in, you don't see them. So we of course couldn't decipher everything, but that was a good start. And then it was, they came in with a camera, 1881, with a camera. Try to think this is very early photography. They took a picture, and more researchers copied it till they got an idea of what it says. And then in 1890, 2 antiquities robbers came with a sledgehammer and broke it out of the rock. They were caught by the Turkish police. They broke it into pieces. They lost one piece on the way, and today it's in the Archaeological Museum of Istanbul, as much as I know at the moment, in a room that isn't open to the public. So if you're going just for that, don't bother.
But they promised
Of course they promised.
that they were going to bring it back.
Oh no, they didn't promise. Israel promised we're going to try to get it back. Don't take that.
At least we have a copy here.
Okay, so there are many copies of this inscription. There's a copy right over there, by the way, on that sign. Not very visible one, but there are a few copies. There's a copy in the Israel Museum and so on. And this inscription actually tells us of 2 groups tunneling one towards each other. And it tells us that as the workers are working and making the tunnel, and when they had just 3 cubits left, this is a cubit from my elbow to the tip of my middle finger. A cubit is about half a meter. 3 cubits left, about 1.5 meters left. They heard the voice of the other group calling, and they met pickaxe to pickaxe, face to face, and allowed the water to flow from the source, from the spring, to the pool in a total of 1,200 cubits, a little bit less than 600 meters. In reality, it's 533, and the water passes in a tunnel that is so deep below surface, it gets to almost 100 cubits, which means 40 to 50 meters below surface in its deepest. Which means this inscription gives you a lot of detail, a lot of information, and no one was supposed to read it. It's inside a tunnel that no one is supposed to walk through, because if you walk through the tunnel, you pollute the water source. So there's an inscription no one is supposed to know it exists. So why write it in the first place? We don't really know, but they did. What didn't they mention? They didn't put dates, they didn't put names, they didn't put anything identifiable. They put their own, let's say, feelings and moment of completing the project and letting the water flow through it. So, what do we know about this tunnel? There's one more word I skipped in the inscription. The word in Hebrew is zada or zada, and no one knows what it means. We just don't have any linguistic knowledge about it. And that made researchers already in the 1920s offer that this channel was done inside a natural crack, widening it, twisting and turning with it wherever it goes. And then what that means is that they knew they're going to make it when they started. Because if I'm widening a natural crack from 2 directions, I will eventually meet pickaxe to pickaxe. So that made a few people ask, so if you know you're going to do it, why are you so happy you managed to? Right? It ruins a little bit of the fun. But then came a geologist from the Hebrew University. His name is Amos Frumkin, and he researched this about 20 years ago, and he published an article named Tunnel Engineering in the Iron Age. I told him, I know him well, I told him, you know what? That name makes no one read your article. You could have called it Proving There's No Crack in Hezekiah's Tunnel. And then maybe a few more people would have read it. It's very long, very complicated, a lot of chemistry, a lot of whatever. And there he describes why there's no chance that there's a natural crack that this tunnel is following for a few different reasons. I'll give you just a little bit of it. One of them is, if there's a natural crack, that means water and air passes through, right? That means I'll be able to hear someone not from 1.5 meters away, but from quite a while earlier. That's one. Two, if there's a natural crack that keeps on flowing non-stop for 2,700 years,
Then water would have carved it out anyway.
it would widen, it would open up. And this thing, you walk through it, you can see the 90-degree angles still there in the upper corners. This is not maintained by any maintenance crew. This is how it was done. And that means that apparently this is not following a natural crack. So in 2006, after his research was published, he gave a lecture. By the way, the lecture took place right here. They put like 50 chairs and he stood right there and he gave a lecture. And I was sitting in the crowd. We talked a little bit, and at the end I asked him the following question. Okay, no crack. You convinced me. How do they do it? He said, I don't know.
Crack.
But I can give you an explanation. And this was his explanation. It's very, very nice. One group started at the spring. The other group started at the pool. What's the fastest way between two dots? A straight line. But they didn't work in a straight line. Because if they work in a straight line, they might accidentally get different directions and get two tunnels that never ever meet. How do I increase the chances of accidentally meeting? Zigzagging on purpose. Doing this on purpose. Widening my space. So even if I miss now, in the next turn, we will break into each other and then I'll have a little bit of extra. Who cares, right? No one cares. But here we're talking about professional engineers or very, very lucky ones. And when they got close to each other, they heard the voices calling and they managed to meet pickaxe to pickaxe. He also shows a few locations where you see in the tunnel that they start in one direction and then suddenly correct themselves in 90 degrees, which means they were listening to echoes and so on. And the last thing he offered is that maybe the inscription really says that in its deepest, the tunnel is about 40, 45 meters below surface. But quite a lot of the way, if I go back to the map, I'll show it to you as easily as it is. Try to locate all this area is very close to surface. When I say very close, it's about 8 to 6 meters from surface. Where does this area pass? Right here. That's the space in front of you, which means we're outside the city. Part of it passes underneath the city where I can't dig from up on top and try to help. But when the good part is outside the city, I can have groups hammering from above on the surface and helping them out. So he asked, from what distance can you hear? He said, I don't know. You need to check the limestone and so on, but these are possibilities to help them meet each other underground.
Listen to the sounds.
Listen to the sounds, and with pounding on the rock, and it's echoing around, you get the basic idea and you start following. So in this way he offered a few answers to how this can be done. The coolest, most amazing explanation was given by Professor Ronnie Reich in his book. The book is called Excavating the City of David, published a decade ago. And that's considered at the moment one of the best books about the city of David. Unfortunately, it was already published a decade ago, so there are quite a few things that happened since. And there's no way to explain what he says to a normal group because there's 6 different phases of how it was done, and I'll need 2 charts, and I don't even bother. But it's a very, very thorough description of what happens before the other and how they were able to get close enough to be able to meet. Bottom line is, they managed to do it. And still today, that thing flows with the water of the Gihon Spring. The floor and walls are plastered. Why plastered? Because without that, water would seep naturally into the rock and get lost. We have plaster from the Iron Age there. How do they know? Because different plaster has different style and different composition. And what happens in plaster is there are lots of materials you throw into it. And they broke pieces of the plaster and found organic remains inside, carbon dated them, from the same period, from the end of the First Temple period, last century and a half. So we have that. But the cool thing about their plaster is that when you walk through the tunnel, the brownish and reddish floor and plaster, that's the original. There are a lot of places where it was filled up in white modern plaster, put in 2008 because the ancient one was falling apart. So they redid it. We need to get some classes by the plasterers from 2,700 years ago because the modern one is already falling apart. When the ancient one in many places is still in very good shape. We need to know how they did it because they were much better than we are today. So that's Hezekiah's tunnel. Getting an explanation of how this thing actually works. And where are we? Outside the city. Where does the tunnel end? A few hundred meters down in that direction. So what we actually need to do right now is go to the Pula Salom, go Pula Shiloh, but we won't. Because going down means climbing back up. Anyways, we're going to be there again in the second temple period tour, because everything you see there is from later on. At the moment, we have nothing from the Iron Age discovered in that area. Everything is later on, so we'll be there again. So I'm going to drop the extra walk, but for you to know, the walk is straight ahead right over here, passing right nearby this big building on the right, which is the first modern building ever built here, built in 1873 by a family that left the Jewish quarter and came to live here on their own and thought they're going to have some peace and quiet till 40 years later when they found an excavation happening in their backyard.
No peace and quiet.
No peace and quiet. They moved later on to the area of Machane Yehuda in the newer Sidra, but that's the area right here in front of us. We're gonna deal with that later on. So that's the way down in between the houses and down to the Shiloh pool, the Pula Salom. That's in that